Hi, Don Feeney, Dakota County Master Gardener, back again to talk about how our tomato plants are progressing here in the South St. Paul trial gardens. As you can see, our vegetation, our plants are really, really lush. Overall, they're doing extremely well, and we're getting some heavy amounts of fruit on these guys. Our plants are just loaded with tomatoes. However, you'll notice that very, very few of them are ripe. And that's a question I've been getting a lot this year. Why aren't my tomatoes ripening? And the answer isn't that they're not ripening, it's that the fruit didn't set early on. Right after we planted the tomatoes, in early June, you might remember we had this stretch of 90 degrees or high 90-degree days. And what happens is when the daytime temperatures get over 90 and the nighttime temperatures get over 70, the blossoms on the tomato plants drop off without forming any fruit. So once the temperatures cool down, they set fruit just like they normally would, and we're seeing the results of that now. But because that what would normally be the first fruit set didn't happen, we're getting our tomatoes a little bit later than we otherwise might. Now our tomatoes here are overall looking pretty healthy. And that's actually kind of one benefit of the drought we've been experiencing is we don't have the moisture that leads to a lot of tomato diseases. But we are seeing some examples of some of the more common tomato diseases here, and I want to talk about those today. Now, tomato diseases in general, there are a lot of them. And this is something that makes me wonder when people say, oh, tomatoes are such an easy plant to grow. No, they're not. They seem to be subject to a lot more bad conditions than a lot of the other plants that we commonly grow for food are not. It's really not surprising when you think about it. I mean, the tomato is a native of Mexico. This is not Mexico. And so, particularly in terms of moisture, it takes a while for the tomatoes to, there's a lot of breeding going on that helps them making them more adaptive to northern conditions. But we have not come anywhere close to achieving perfection on those yet. Now, when you buy tomato plants or tomato seed, I've seen the recommendation to you'll see these plants, varieties that have lots of letters after their names. Those are indicative of resistance to a number of tomato diseases. That's the good news. There's been a lot of work done on breeding resistance into the tomato plants. The bad news is that, by and large, those are not the diseases that you commonly find in Minnesota. You know, why is that? Well, I don't know. They may be harder to breed resistance for the diseases that we deal with here. But I think it's also because most of the tomato development work and the breeding is being funded by the large commercial interests, and they are interested in the diseases that are prevalent in the areas where large numbers of tomatoes are grown for shipping, canning, whatever, i.e. Florida, California, a couple of other places. And those are just not the diseases that we have here. So you'll see very commonly the letter V after a tomato seed or a plant, which is for verticillium root. Not a common problem in Minnesota. Not non-existent, but not common. Then you'll see F and a couple of different varieties of F, fusarium wilt. Again, not a Minnesota problem. And you see N, nematodes. The nematodes that affect tomatoes, not an issue here. So that is not a lot of help. The other thing with the letters, you'll see, well, that means that all of the heirlooms I see, which don't have those letters, have no disease resistance, and that's nonsense. Because they would not be heirlooms. They would have not lasted generation after generation after generation if they immediately succumbed to every disease that was out there. The thing is that nobody has a financial interest in testing the heirlooms for resistance, and therefore they are not entitled to have those letters after those names. It's just simply because they can't be patented. The seed companies don't make large amounts of money off them, not enough to make it worthwhile to test. Now, the diseases that are most common here are fungal. And the one that by far is the most common, we can see starting on this plant down here. If we look at the foliage here, it's called early blight. It is a soil-borne disease. It overwinters in the soil, and it infects the plant when rain or watering splashes the infected soil up onto the plant. Now, the leaves get these big spots on them. Here's a good example of one where it's further along, and you see these big black spots on the edges. Those leaves die. It starts at the bottom. It works its way up the plants, and this also affects the fruit too. You will get these spots on the fruit that renders that tomato inedible. And it is here pretty much inevitable that you will get some early blight. There are a couple of things you can do to at least slow it down. A big one is to mulch around your plants, and you can see here we have our red plastic that goes right up to the base of the plant. And the point there is that limits the amount of soil that can splash up onto the leaves. The second thing you can do is when you water your tomato plants, as the saying goes, water the soil, not the plant. Bring your hose right in down here to the base of the plant and water there. Now, the obvious problem with that strategy is rain doesn't know to do that. That waters the plant, not the soil, and you will still get the splash and you will still get the blight. Third thing you can do, rotate your crops. Try not to grow tomatoes where they have been grown in the last 3 years. The problem is that doesn't work real well when you have limited home garden space. It's hard to get that kind of good rotation with enough distancing to ensure that that will happen. So it may well be that early blight is something that you just have to live with. Well, once it shows up, what can you do to at least slow it down, if not eliminate it? What you do is when you see the plants starting to show some of the evidence of early blight, cut those leaves off. And I don't mean just take the leaf off here, I mean go down to the end of this stem here and cut it off or break it off. And then don't put this in your home compost pile, you'll just be compounding the problem. Dispose of it in some way that take it to a yard waste site where the compost piles can be big enough and hot enough that it will kill the fungus. Now, yes, you can do some spraying for early blight with fungicide. That's difficult to do. It's marginally effective, but because what you need to do is the fungus splashes up and lands on the underside of the leaf, so you have to spray the undersides of the leaves, and that's a tricky thing to do, and it's a tricky thing to do thoroughly. So it's you can try that if you like. Don't be afraid, however, to prune lots of the foliage off. I have heard of tomato gardeners, and I want to try this some year, who actually preemptively prune off the lower branches on their tomato plants. And you can take like up to 1/3 of the leaves off of a tomato plant, and it will be just fine. And if it's infected, take more, because what the heck? I mean, you've got nothing to lose. But as I said, that is the most common problem that we find on tomatoes in Minnesota. Now, the second most common disease is, again, another fungal disease that infects the leaves. And here's an example of this. Is called Septoria leaf blight. It's, again, a fungal disease, but you see what you get here are these smaller black dots on there. Now, Septoria is not quite as common as early blight, at least in my experience. It's also a little less serious because Septoria affects the leaves and will eventually weaken the plant, go kind of work its way up the leaves like early blight does. However, Septoria does not transfer to the fruit. You will not see the Septoria spots, fungus, find their way onto the fruit. So you'll have more, if you have an infested plant, more of the fruit will actually be edible than will be the case with early blight. A couple of other conditions that we commonly see, and people say, oh, what's this disease on my plant and can I spray for it? Actually aren't diseases. Here's one that you see a lot early in the year. This is called blossom end rot, where the area around the base of the plant kind of turns brown and then black, and the fruit becomes totally inedible. This is something you see on the first, tends to be on larger fruited tomatoes. I've never seen it on a cherry tomato. And it tends to be with the first few fruits of the year. And what causes this, it's a calcium deficiency. It's not a disease. Now, the soil here, however, has plenty of calcium. That's not the problem. The problem is that in the early stages of the plant growth, sometimes it can be difficult for that calcium to be taken up by the plant and transmitted to the fruit and to the leaves. And a lot of that has to do sometimes with uneven watering, so you can maybe do a little bit of prevention of blossom end and rot by keeping your tomato watering on a schedule. Again, the problem is rain doesn't understand that. And so you can get a heavy, you might get from a very heavy rain, uneven watering, the result is blossom end rot. The good news is that after the first fruit set of the year, it tends to go away. You're not going to, this is not a problem you're going to be seeing on your fruits in August and September. You'll see here we've got this cracking and brown growth starting on this developing fruit here. This is called cat facing. And again, it's not a disease, it is an environmental issue. Researchers are not 100% clear on what the cause of cat facing is. Some varieties are just a lot more prone to it than other varieties are. And so if you wind up growing a variety of tomato and it's got a lot of cat facing on it, what you do is plant a different variety next year. The fruit, if I had left this on the plant, this would be ugly, but it would still be edible. You just have to cut around those areas and it would be just fine. This has been, cat facing has been something that's been a target of tomato breeders for a long time. There were references going back into the mid-1800s about trying to breed plants that showed less cat facing, and no one's been able to accomplish that in all that time. But again, it's a very common problem, one you can't do a heck of a lot about. Just either learn to live with it, or or again, as I said, choose different varieties. Now, another common problem that I don't have an example of here because it hasn't been raining very much is called cracking, and you'll see or splitting. And there you've got a fruit that just as it gets ripe, you'll see that it splits open. Still edible, but it's very very watery. Very, very common in cherry tomatoes, not common at all in larger fruit. Now, that splitting comes about when you have, say, a heavy rainfall, and the plant sucks up all this water gets transmitted into the fruit, and the fruit grows and expands faster than the skin does, and so the skin breaks, and you wind up with that crack. And some of my favorite tomato varieties, cherry tomato varieties, are really, really prone to that. Sun Gold is one of the best tasting tomatoes ever bred, but if you look at it wrong after a rainfall, it will crack. What you can do, plant varieties that are less prone to cracking. Or another thing you can do is that if a heavy rain is forecast, go out and pick your cherry tomatoes. In particular, the ones that you know of that have been prone to cracking, and pick the ones that are almost but not quite ripe. Bring those inside and let them ripen on your countertop, and you will have avoided the cracking, at least from that particular rainfall. That's what you have to be concerned with about tomato diseases and other conditions here. For the most part, if some others pop up during the year, we will be sure to show those to you. But that's your basic tomato disease Minnesota primer.